Thanks very much for that, Callum, and thanks very much to the CC team for inviting me to give this hopefully short and informative talk on pink salmon. Hopefully that you can see the screen as I see it. So I'll just move on from now. So a little bit of context here, I think. First being that we have a relatively depauperate fish community within Scotland. Obviously, after the last ice age, in this post-glacial period, most of the fish species which we consider to be freshwater in Scotland all arrived via the sea, with the exception of a small number of freshwater invaders like pike, minnows, roach, stone loach, and perch, which managed to invade the east coast of the country at a time when the British Isles were physically connected to mainland Europe. And in fact, rivers like the Thames were merely tributaries of the Rhine, for example. But there's a long history of introducing fish into Scotland. And we can see there that Pacific salmonids, like pink salmon, have managed to breach our shores since at least the 1880s, when the first sort of Pacific salmonid, the brook char, quite often referred to as brook trout, was introduced into Scotland for sporting and ornamental purposes. And since 1970, or just before 1970, we've had obviously rainbow trout, which is one of the biggest sort of fishery-based salmonids in the UK and elsewhere. That's a Pacific salmonid, but also obviously pink salmon, and that's what we're here to talk about today. But in terms of how these things actually get here, we're in a period of global warming and things have opened up globally. There's many ways to transport ourselves around the country, and of course as humans move around, they also move fish as well, or other things. So we've transported things as a commodity, for example. Things have come in through ballast, so arrival with transport. We've opened up waterways. We've created canals. We've allowed animals to disperse themselves through those waterways. So things which are, ironically, conservation priorities in the UK, like sea lamprey, are now a nuisance in the Great Lakes, and they got there through the use of canals in North America. We've also managed to transfer fish with water, and if you look at the way we transfer water around with hydro in Scotland alone, there are some well-documented instances where new fish species have appeared in lakes where they didn't appear before, just by dint of the transfer of water. So intercatchment transfer is a known vector for the movement of fish. But we also deliberately stock fish as well, not just fish from other parts of the globe, but also fish which come from other parts of the UK. And in fact, I would argue that fish which are introduced to catchments to which they were non-native before can actually be as big a problem as some of those species which have been stocked from much further afield. We also have fish which arrive as passengers as well. This is one of for example, a topmouth gudgeon, which looks very cyprinidae. It looks like a small roach, and in fact has been introduced with consignments of fish used for stocking as well. So, and also we have a history of using fish as bait. European minnow, yes, a species which is native to southeast Scotland, is now present throughout the British Isles, including on our islands, and as far afield as the Western Isles, for example, where it was discarded either as bait or used as food for fish like trout, for example. And these things can all cause a problem. We also have aquarium releases and things with fish which are kept in ponds. And of course, some of these are located within floodplains which flood. And of course, those animals escape into the wild. So the well-documented issue of Asian carp in Mississippi making its way up to the Great Lakes you know, these were things which originated from sort of rather pedestrian sources. There's also the issue of covert rewilding, and you know, obviously we could talk all day about the introduction of beavers, and you know how and why some of these animals have managed to find their way into some of our waterways. Some of them legal, some of them not so legal. And there's also things like ritual releases, and there is, you know, we have to think about kind of the different myriad of religions we have here, and some of those actually involve the release of live animals as part of a process. But we're here to talk about pink salmon, and so pink salmon has been widely introduced through other parts of the world. Its original distribution is in the Pacific, as you might imagine, as far north as the Lena River in Siberia and the Mackenzie River in Canada, down to Korea in the south and the Sacramento River in California. It's a rather unusual species. It has populations which run up rivers to spawn in odd years, and populations which run up rivers to spawn in even years. So 1990, for example, being an even year, and 1991 being an odd year. It's got a 2-year life cycle, and as I say, the southern, the even year fish appear in every second year, and the same for the odd year fish, and they do that obviously in tandem, if you like. Some facts about it. I mean, I think that just, you know, the pink salmon is the most abundant of all Pacific salmonids, and you can go into any of your local supermarkets or corner stores and pick up tins of pink salmon. It's one of those species which is widely exploited. It's a cool water species. It's got a temperature range which is, you know, we regard as being temperate, if you like, so just under 6 degrees, in fact, to just under 15 degrees. Grows best around 10. And like our own native Atlantic salmon, it's got a lethal temperature in the mid 20 degrees. So yeah, it's a species which is well suited to life in the temperate zone in which we find ourselves, but also further north as well. Of the two races, if you like, odd year and even year pink salmon, the odd year population is the one which is the most abundant of the two. And in fact, this dominance is increasing. There are lots more of these fish around than even year fish. And it's a really quite interesting population dynamic. But because these fish spawn in different years, there's not a lot of genetic transfer between the two of those, and we have a degree of genetic isolation between these populations, so they are genetically different. They don't home with the same degree of accuracy as we might expect for salmonids. We always think about Atlantic salmon and the fact that Atlantic salmon return to the river in which they themselves were spawned. It's a bit less precise when we talk about pink salmon, and that's thought to be really due to the fact that once those eggs hatch and the fish emerge from the gravels, these really small smolts, if you like, which are, you know, just around 3 centimeters in length, don't spend much time in fresh water as they move almost immediately down to estuarine environments. Spend about 6 months there before they go out to sea for 1.5 years and then come back as two-year-old adults. So they don't have that same degree of site fidelity that we might associate with salmonids within the Atlantic. But they are very plastic, an incredibly plastic species. So plastic, in fact, that introduced pink salmon in the Great Lakes now complete their entire life cycle in fresh water. So this is a species which is able to adapt. Salmonids in general, including our own Atlantic salmon, our own trout, our own Arctic char, which are all salmonids. These are species which are well known for their plasticity, their ability to develop locally adaptive traits, if you like, and survive Just a little bit about the life stage itself. I mean, pink salmon come into our rivers generally towards the end of June, beginning of July. The spawning period extends from July and, from our experience, just into September, although in some parts it ranges as far as October. They're semiparous, so none of these fish survive to spawn a second time. They'll all die after spawning, and that's really important because we'll come on to that in a second. And they take about 610 degree days to hatch, so that means that they usually emerge from the reds around sort of January to March time, and of course that's really dependent on water temperature, and that's where the degree day element of this comes in. So yeah, a really adaptive species with a very distinct life history, which differs quite a little bit from our own salmonids. So how did they get here? Well, the origin of pink salmon in Western Europe, or Atlantic Europe, really comes from our colleagues in Russia, where there was a desire to establish pink salmon populations in the White Sea Basin in the 1950s. And initially, when they did this, they used fish which were sourced from even year populations. And these even year fish weren't particularly well adapted to the cold water conditions that they would experience in the really high north of Russia into the Arctic Circle. And over the period of stocking there, it was relatively unsuccessful. But there were some runs, but it was problematic. So they ceased that in 1979, and in the mid-80s, they switched to an odd year stock, which was better adapted to the prevailing conditions and took off incredibly quickly. And those populations have been exploited since that time. They didn't have to stock any more fish beyond 1998 because the populations were, as I say, well established and self-sustaining. And now they're exploited to the extent of several hundred metric tons. So yeah, a well-established species. They didn't really move too much before then, but there were some vagrants. So from a Scottish context, we've had pink salmon recorded in Scotland since 1960. Very, very few of them. Only 16 confirmed pink salmon over a period of 56 years. So that is not a lot. We are talking about vagrants here. We're not talking about large numbers of animals appearing. Most of those fish, in fact, all of those before 1973, were all picked up in coastal nets which no longer operate in Scotland. Since 2003, we've had some picked up in rivers to the rod, locally to me in the River Learan, just a couple of miles down the road, but also in the River Tweed. So the Tweeds had a few, and there's one in the Tay as well. Most of them are on the East Coast, and we'll come back to that in a second, but it's obviously not exclusively so. So actually, there's the picture on the bottom left was one of the very first pink salmon ever captured in Scotland. But what's changed? Well, 2017 changed. In 2017, I remember when I was sitting in a hotel room in Hong Kong, looking at records pinging in through Twitter and all sorts of social media outlets. It became very apparent that pink salmon were on the move. They were recorded in over 200 rivers in Norway, 23 in Scotland. They appeared in Ireland, Denmark, Iceland, and smaller numbers in other countries, for example, England and Northern Ireland, France and Germany. So we obviously had records of fish which were caught in rivers, but at the same time there were large numbers, we understand, picked up in some of the coastal nets. Many of those remained unreported, certainly in terms of numbers. So where were they? Well, until now, using all of the records from 2017 onwards, they've appeared largely on the east and north coast of the UK, but it's not entirely so. I mean, we've picked fish up in far in the southwest is the River Camel. Some of the rivers in the south, direct south of England, for example, the Avon and the Froom, but also on the west coast of Ireland as well. But I would say dominated by catches in the north and east. So since 2017, what happened then? Well, there was 139 records in 2017, and we expected a similar number or more to appear in 2019. That wasn't the case. There was only 21 fish recorded then. But that could have been for any number of reasons, actually. And one of the probably the most sensible of those is that in 2017, we experienced a year of low flow. Many rivers were in drought. Fish could be seen very easily. Lots of anglers were on the scene as well. And we had that number of records. And of course, there was, as I said, there was many more being caught elsewhere in coastal areas. In 2019, it was a very wet year, if you remember that. There was lots of high flow events, not so many anglers around, and of course not so many fish seen. That's not to say that those fish weren't there. It's just that there were fewer fish caught and fewer fish seen. And then in 2021, we had the highest number yet. And we'll go into kind of how some of those fish were recorded in a couple of seconds. But one thing is, we look at the kind of the methods of capture here. If you look at the use of nets, I mean, I think that the way we record some of these data will play a significant role in kind of the numbers of fish which have been reported. So, for example, in 2017, 50 fish were caught by net. A lot of those were actually caught in the River Dee, for example. That was probably the biggest source of fish in that year, and they were removed by those means. And in 2021, 78 fish were removed by net, largely in the River Thurso. So it depends very much on the activities of the local river managers as to how many fish are in the river and what sort of methodology they use to try and remove them. But what's consistent about this is obviously the number of fish which fall to rods as well, and the kind of the importance of anglers and anglers' sightings in terms of trying to get to grips with the sort of the prevalence of pink salmon in our rivers. One thing to suppose point out about 2021 is the reference to spear guns and blanks. I'm not talking about blank cartridges and guns, but in terms of spear guns, our Norwegian colleagues use the removal of pink salmon by spear gun as one of their principal means of removal, because they can actually target pink salmon and not inadvertently catch Atlantic salmon as well. In terms of when they arrive, it's relatively consistent. We're talking about kind of early July, late June. And in terms of our last records, very consistent, kind of usually the first or second week in September. Fish tend to spawn towards late July and into August. And of course that seems to show some consistency between years, but also across localities. There's a tremendous congruence between spawning times and in the UK and spawning times elsewhere in Europe, particularly in Norway. So a little bit about where those fish actually were. There was a few maps put up there, and those came from Fishing Management Scotland from their recording tool, which we'll talk about in a second. Lots of rivers were visited once within that three-year period. Those visits are located around the country, including the north and west of Scotland. But if you look at the number of areas where fish are visited on 2 or 3 of those years, we can see a distinct pattern arising, and that tends to be arrivals within East Coast rivers. I think the one I want to really focus on here is the one where fish have appeared in each of the 3 years where we might have expected them to. So we look particularly at the rivers Dee, Devon, Ness, North Esk, Oikle, Spey, Tay and Tweed. These have been visited in every single year since 2017, where we expect this odd year population to arrive. The reasons for this are unclear. It could be, for example, that these are rivers which have high discharges, and pink salmon which are passing by are attracted to those high discharge events from those rivers. It has been said that there's potential for pink salmon to follow Atlantic salmon into some of these rivers. Not entirely sure what the case is. You know, it could well be something to do with catchment geology and the smell of the Q which attracts them to those rivers. It could also be, as is the case with lamprey, for example, that rivers which have previously held that species hold some sort of pheromone cue or chemical cue which attracts them back. No one's entirely sure. What's interesting about this, though, is that of those rivers which have been visited on those 3 successive occasions, they account for about 66% of the total rod catch of Atlantic salmon in Scotland. So in terms of, you know, kind of, are these rivers important for Atlantic salmon? Yes, they absolutely are. But data is absolutely everything. And so in terms of data quality and quantity, what's been a significantly improved tool in our armoury is the development of Fishery Management Scotland's pink salmon records map. It's an application which allows anglers to input data relating to their catches. So this has been informed by better guidance on how to identify pink salmon and what to do once you catch them. It's stuff that's been guidance provided by Fishery Management Scotland, but also by Marine Scotland. And so there should be, you know, plenty of guidance out there to help us identify a pink salmon as against something else. So we're collecting information on location, method of capture, some physical attributes, length, weight, those sorts of things, the sex of the animal, but also affords the opportunity to upload a photograph of it as well, so we can, you know, firmly identify whether it was a pink salmon or not. So that's been a significant step forward and been really, really helpful. But I think that there are still some difficulties when it comes to identifying pink salmon, and I think I just want to put up a couple of examples. One of them is relevant to the UK, one of them is relevant to Northern Europe. If we look at the left, we see a silvered pink salmon. This is what it looks like when it first enters our rivers. To all intents and purposes, it looks like a small grouse. If you know what to look for, it's obvious. You know, look at the spotted tail and the coloured tongue and the overall head shape. You could, if you were experienced, you would be able to know the difference. But for some anglers, these may well have been misidentified as grouse, or if they've seen fish in situ without catching them, they may well be misidentified as grouse. So there could be potential there for misidentifying what would be pink salmon as grouse or grouse as pink salmon. To the right, if you look at what's a female pink salmon after it's been in the river for a few days, it starts to colour up, starts to look olive green. And in places in Europe where we have anadromous or seagoing Arctic char, there's been the misreporting of pink salmon as Arctic char, for example. It's unlikely that you would be able to misidentify the adult male pink salmon. That's the one in the top right-hand column. And there you see the fish has gone from this nice silvery fusiform type shape to this humped back. And in fact, the nickname or local name for pink salmon within its native range is a humpback salmon for that very reason. But I'm just going to sort of exemplify where this can become really quite serious. This is the situation in Norway. We'll look at the figures on the left-hand side, were published by Odd Sandland and others. We can see this rapid spread of pink salmon through the length of Norway. And if we look at the scale of invasion, you can see it's most significant in the north of the country, but it is extending from the top to the very bottom of the country. Ironically, in 2017, 260 rivers were affected. In the most recent data from 2019, 2021 have shown that actually fewer rivers have been invaded, but with much higher numbers of fish. And there's some quite some significant and spectacular photographs of removal in some of these systems, and it's been done in a almost industrial scale. But if you look at the graph on the bottom right-hand side, we look at the phases of invasive species invasion and control. Where are we on this particular graph? I mean, I think that, or on this cycle, we've had this kind of first occurrence, the very low numbers of animals. Well, they've been around since 1960. They've never presented a problem. I would suggest that as we get towards the right-hand side of the shaded column, that's probably where we are just now. We have scattered locations and more animals. I think our Norwegian colleagues are probably a little bit further up that curve at the point where they are engaging in really active management and eradication. We've somewhere along that line ourselves, despite the fact that our numbers of animals are several orders of magnitude lower, but there is active removal. But it's an interesting graph in terms of where it is in terms of control costs, because as larger numbers of these animals appear, then the cost of control may turn out to be really significant. So what does it mean in terms of our ecology? Well, there are some positives and negatives to this. We have this massive increase of, potentially massive increase of marine derived nutrients. At a time when many fishery managers in Scotland are busily putting in, bags of fish farm feed or deer legs or things like that to increase the amounts of nutrients available to Atlantic salmon. This is coming at no cost from pink salmon. Pink salmon are coming there, they spawn and they die, and those bodies start to decompose and release nutrients. So you could potentially have an increased production of invertebrates and, by dint of that, an increased production of fish. It's also been said, whether you want to agree with this opinion or not, is that it could potentially act as an alternative fishery at a time when Atlantic salmon numbers are going down. That's really a point of opinion for some people. The opposite is also true, of course, in terms of the arrival of these animals may take away from the purity or the experience of fishing for native salmonids. So there are some negatives. This input of marine derived nutrients can have potentially negative impacts as well. It can increase the phosphorus levels, for example, to a point where it may become a negative impact on freshwater pearl mussels, as an example. But these animals themselves, once they arrive, are fairly aggressive. They're not fairly aggressive, they're very aggressive. And they can disturb and displace native salmonids or other fish species. We're not just talking about salmonids here. And it can also have potentially life history impacts. For example, if we increase the number and growth rate or survival of Atlantic salmon in our streams, what does that mean further down the line in terms of the life history of Atlantic salmon who might go to sea as smaller smolts, for example? What does that mean for them? So there's also potentially competition from pink salmon smolts. We know from some of our colleagues in Norway that these smolts aren't just emerging from the gravels and going straight to sea. Some of those small 3-centimetre smolts are hanging about in rivers for longer periods. If they are hanging about for longer periods, they must be eating something. And if they are eating something, they're taking it away from something else. So there's potential for competition there from smolts. And of course, smolts themselves may act as potential prey for some of our native salmons as well. So not entirely well understood. There's always potential for disease or parasite transmission. Certainly fish which have been examined within the UK haven't shown up anything which is problematic. But of course, potential is always there. They can overcut some sea lamprey reds, and I've got a slide I'll show you about that in a few seconds. But they can also attract predators as well. So I'll put the last two bullet points in together. I mean, by attracting predators, they can attract mammals which may feed on them, for example, like otters, or potentially piscivorous birds, but obviously these are relatively large animals. But it can also attract other anglers as well, so there's possibly a greater potential for illegal fishing as well. But we have a risk assessment for it. There's a risk assessment for pink salmon in the UK. There's risk assessments in Norway as well, and they are largely agree with each other. But what I really want to point out is when we look at our confidence levels in relation to risk of pink salmon to native biodiversity, our confidence is relatively low. And so we do have an information or a knowledge deficit there. So we have to answer some kind of key questions. First of all, although they're there, are they becoming established? They may well be there, but they're spawning and not really doing anything else and not recruiting. Is that really a problem? There's been some really good work carried out in the Ness and in the D by people like Chris Conroy, who you'll hear from in a few minutes. Also people like Al Reeve and the District Salmon Fishery Board, using things like drones and GoPros to look at spawning behaviour, map out reds and things like that as well. So they're definitely there, they are definitely spawning. Some work carried out by Chris that you'll hear about from his work in 2017, actually tracking some of these fish through from the egg stage right through to alevins. So yes, they are successfully spawning. They are, to all intents and purposes, it seems like they are recruiting. How extensive that is and how successful it is up for grabs at the moment. But we also trying to get to grips with well, are our rivers actually suitable for them? And of course we know physically, because they have spawned and all the rest of it, that they are obviously suitable, but through things like the work carried out by Marine Scotland Science, particularly Ian Malcolm and the Scottish River Temperature Monitoring Network, that we can start to get to grips with the temperature regimes in our rivers and when we might expect spawning to take place and for eggs to emerge. So we're starting to build up that knowledge base. Also looking at some more novel approaches to look at where pink salmon are located, and this is in the bottom portion of this slide. Some work which was carried out in the River Dee with the Better Match Nova from Marine Scotland Science and Ian Reeve, Al Reeve from the District Salmon Fishery Board, along with ourselves as well, trying to look at the use of eDNA as a method of monitoring the arrival and the distribution of pink salmon within a very large catchment. And we've also carried out some of that work with the Ness board as well, with Chris Conroy too. But even if they are to spawn, what's the potential for integration with Atlantic salmon? Well, in actual fact, Atlantic salmon, Atlantic salmonids and Pacific salmonids diverged from each other, over 50 million years ago. Atlantic salmon and all of the Pacific salmon have different numbers of chromosomes, so integration or crossbreeding is unlikely to occur, even if they were to spawn at the same times. But in terms of the temporal aspects, do they overlap with Atlantic salmon? No, they certainly don't. We know that our pink salmon arrive and spawn, as I said, from July to mid-September, and that doesn't overlap with our own Atlantic salmon or any of our other salmonids. So our salmonids spawn from October onwards in the case of trout, and from November onwards in the case of Atlantic salmon. So that temporal overlap doesn't exist, although there could be potential for a spatial overlap. They certainly spawn in the same sorts of areas. And so do the lampreys as well. So this is coming back to what I said there about potential impact on sea lamprey. Sea lamprey reds will be active during at least the earlier part of the spawning period for pink salmon. So of all of our freshwater fish species which may be impacted, sea lamprey may well be the one. Other work which is going on really looks at this, kind of the impact of marine-derived nutrients and ecosystem functioning. There's some work going on just now with a Horizon 2020 project called Pinksies, based down in Queen Margaret College in London, and we're involved in that alongside colleagues with Marine Scotland, FMS, and others, which is looking at some of these more ecologically based issues. We have to sort of really trying to get the grips to what is the real impact of pink salmon in terms of ecosystem functioning within Scottish streams. So that's work which is in progress. There's no results or data to impart to you at this point in time, but those will become clear as we move forward in this year and the next, and as we collaborate with colleagues in other parts of Europe. So with that, I think I'll close. That's enough sort of information overload just now. So thanks for listening, and I put some acknowledgements there from people in Marine Scotland Science, people in FMS, the Leadership Salmon Fishery Board, Chris Conroy, and Queen University of London, and I'll finish there. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. Just as you're taking the presentation down, a couple of things. Firstly, you don't want to be waiting on a bus or waiting on Colin to pick you up if he says he's coming in 20 minutes. I think that was worth the extended presentation time. I think there's a lot of information there that I think I certainly found useful to hear about that in sort of logical and thoughtful way. There's a couple of questions really. Well, there's one statement really from Brian Davison from Fishery Management Scotland, which is really about the fish on the Thurso, confirming that the fish caught there were by targeted electrofishing. So when the adults were around, I guess they were out to get them directly. The question from Stuart Pritchard, though, Colin, which you might want to either respond to just now or stick up your jumper for later, because I'm quite keen to get Chris Conroy's presentation on in case folk have got to be away by 8. But is there a significant risk to freshwater pearl mussels if the Glycidia for pearl mussels, which normally would insist on a salmonic gills for 9 months, are carried out to sea by shorter stay pink salmon smolts? So basically, insistment to pink salmon smolts, and then they disappear to sea with the Glycidia attached. I'm not sure if there's an issue with that, given the size of the pink salmon smolts, maybe is limiting that factor. But I don't know if you've got any immediate comments on that.
Yeah, this was an issue that was brought up in a seminar I was at in Norway last week. I don't think it is a significant issue insofar as pearl mussels are concerned, given the timing of emigration and obviously the fact that we have these large adults aren't suitable for encystment anyway. But never say never with these things. I think some of these smolts may stay about for a little bit longer than we might imagine it, and they could well be an issue as we go on. We really don't know, unfortunately. Okay,
and there's one more, Kyle Cran, who's joined us from Canada. So welcome, Kyle, and really pleased you'll be able to come and take part of this. God knows what time it is over there. I don't know if you're behind or forward. Given that pinks are an ocean-type fish, I'm not sure the smolts have a large impact on competition in freshwater streams. In the ocean, do they have a similar distribution, Colin, or use the same feeding areas as the Atlantic salmon? If they also spawn at different times, could they then be classed as an introduced species rather than an invasive, or is that intent of future studies? So maybe there's first question is about feeding areas in the Atlantic, if they're going to be in the same place as the Atlantic, and then the second point about classification really between introduced or invasives. And then once we've got a quick response to that, we'll give Chris Conroy the floor.
Okay, so the Norwegians have done some work on this, some marine trawls, and in areas where they've been picking up pink salmon, they haven't been picking up Atlantic salmon. So there does seem to be a disjoint in terms of the areas where where both species feed. But this is based on a relatively light sampling programme. It may well turn out to be the case where there is an overlap, but at the current moment in time, it seems as if there isn't. So there doesn't seem to be competition at sea. But I mean, in terms of the other question about being classified as an introduced species rather than invasive, yeah, I would think in a UK context, it's invasive. It has to be invasive. They weren't introduced, they weren't deliberately introduced. They've got here, and they are invasive here rather than introduced.
Yeah, thanks for that. Chris, I'm going to introduce you. We've got another question coming from Conroy, but I'm maybe going to suggest that, Colin, you might want to respond to that directly into the chat, because then we can allow Chris to set his presentation up. The next presentation is from Chris Conroy, who's now technical project manager with the Atlantic Salmon Trust, working specifically on the River Laxford, and Chris has been in that post for all of 3 weeks, so congratulations on the new role, Chris, and I hope Shona, who's also in the talk, hasn't broken you today on the Laxford. Before that, though, Chris was director at the River Ness District Salmon Fishery Board for a number of years, and was really at the forefront of the investigations on the pink salmon as they arrived in Scotland, particularly on the Ness, and I think, you know, was really pivotal with colleagues in the other fishery boards and trusts, and Marine Scotland Science and Fishery Management Scotland and Nature Scot, of formulating information and gathering information that helps us understand what's going on here. So this is really the response, if you like, from the fishery management perspective. So without further ado, Chris, I shall shut up and pass the floor to you.
Thanks very much, Alan and Vicky, for inviting me along today. Really appreciate that. So I'm going to talk about our journey in 2017 when these fish appeared and how we had to basically fumble our way through to find out what to do about them and to learn about them. And I have to say, at this point, it was very much a team effort. We got absolutely amazing support from Colin at Scottish Natural Heritage, or Nature Scot, also Brian and Alan at Fisheries Management Scotland, and also Marine Scotland Science as well, particularly the Freshwater Lab and the policy team, actually. So it was very much a sort of team effort, this was. Okay, so for us, things really started with the capture of a Pacific pink salmon on the 6th of July in 2017. We'd seen some reports in Ireland of these fish being caught, but we really never thought they would come as far as the Ness. So we had a capture, and then we popped it up on our social media, which resulted in another report of a fish that had been caught the previous day and been misidentified as a grilse, which is a one-sea winter Atlantic salmon. And in the end, by the end of the season, we had 6 rod-caught fish, all caught by rod and line anglers, and we also had a further 2 which were targeted capture, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So initially, the sort of advice and thoughts were, you know, these weren't really going to do anything. They may just be lost. They may enter the river and leave again. So what we did is we just gathered as much information as we could from the fish that had been caught. And I think it's first, I know Colin talked about identification. I think it's just worth covering that again in case any anglers are listening and they may catch them in future. The key sort of distinctive features on these fresh run fish is this: they have a white mouth on the outside, but the gums and tongue are very black, which if you do salmon fishing, is very unusual. The other thing is they have these really spotty tails. They've got big oval black spots. This picture's not great, but you can just about make out these big oval black spots on the fish. The other thing, which for me is the most distinctive thing, is very small scales, and they very easily dislodged. If you see any pictures of pink salmon, they've generally got lots of scale loss on them, and that's because when they're fresh in the river, you touch them, the scales just fall off. And they've got a very different head shape as well. So first thing we did was we took some scales from these fish and had a look at them. And this figure here shows, on the left, you've got a 2.5 pound or 2 3/4 pound Atlantic salmon, a scale from a 2 3/4 pound Atlantic salmon. On the right, we've got a scale from a 2 3/4 pound of Pacific pink salmon that was caught in 2017. And you can see here the difference in age of these fish. The Atlantic salmon was 3 years old, so it spent 2 years in fresh water as a juvenile, and then it headed out to sea for 1 and a bit years. So a total of 3 years, whereas the pink salmon at the same age had spent just 1+ years, or almost 2 years in fresh water. And as you'll know, the Atlantic salmon, they tend to spend 2 to 3 years in fresh water before leaving to go to the sea, whereas the pink salmon hatch and head straight out into the estuary, and so they don't have this freshwater growth. And this part of doing this was, I mean, to be totally honest with you, when we first saw these fish, none of us in our team had any experience of them, and this was just another way of confirming that it was indeed a pink salmon. In terms of the scales as well, what we found is, if you, the top picture here, you'll see the scale has a very smooth edge on the outside of it, whereas the bottom one is very eroded. And what this is where the fish is reabsorbing its reabsorbing minerals as part of the spawning process and the spawning development process. This takes quite a period of time in the Atlantic salmon, but we were seeing just a matter of weeks this level of erosion, which is quite unusual for us. And you can see here the bottom picture is a female pink salmon in her spawning colours, with this very olive green coloured upper part of her body, and then a very white belly. So we also, with these fish, the next thing was to do an internal examination of these fish. This one here was caught. It was a mature female caught on the 26th of July. She was 5 pounds in weight, and as you can see, she's absolutely full of eggs. And this was a bit of a shock for us at first, just to see that the level of development in this fish. And we reckoned there'd be about 1,700 eggs. We saw no obvious signs of internal damage, parasites or disease, but we were quite limited on the equipment we had, so it was really looking for larger parasites. Then we also had a good look at this mature male, which was caught on the 29th of July. And again, you can see this was 3 pounds. You can see the gonads were very highly developed. And again, no signs of internal parasites or disease. But as I say, the development of these eggs and the male's gonads was a real warning sign for us. For the first time, we thought these fish may actually spawn, which we just didn't expect. So because of that, we thought we'd better have a look and see whether, for any spawning activity, just to see whether we could check whether they were actually going through the motions or not. So we decided to put a number of surveillance cameras in the river, just basically GoPro action cameras at various locations in areas that look like the fish may spawn. And after about a couple of weeks, we got the first sighting of a mature female, and that was on the 8th of August. And then a couple of days later, a male appeared in the same area, and we thought, oh, something may be happening here. And then on the 11th, we managed to capture footage of them paired up, a male on the left and a female on the right here. And the female was actually cutting a red as well. And then finally, on the 14th of August, we managed to capture the moment of fertilization, where the male fertilized the female's eggs, so she deposited them in her nest. And this was a real landmark moment for us. This was actually proof that this non-native species was indeed spawning in the river. I've got a little bit of footage here. I hope it works for everybody, but this is footage of the fish spawning in the river nest. You can see she's cutting her nest with a tail, and then she dips down and she lays her eggs, and then the male fertilizes it. So as I say, we got really quite excited when we saw this, because this is the first time I think this had been captured in the UK. So then we thought, we know this spawned, but would those eggs actually be viable? Would they develop and would they hatch? So the next, in consultation with S&H, Marine Scotland and FMS, we decided to look at ways of trying to determine whether these eggs were viable or not. And the first attempt was to try and catch some of these spawning fish before they'd spawned, so the eggs actually, and then we could see the development in the river. Here on the nest, we managed to capture 2 female fish, but they both already spawned. and they were more successful, and they did manage to get hold of some eggs over that way. I think, well, I'm not sure they took them from adults, but they did manage to get hold of some eggs. The interesting thing here, if you look at the bottom left, what these fish do is the females lay their eggs. Unlike the Atlantic salmon, they stay on the red and they defend it. They are really quite aggressive. Any leaves or litter or any other fish that come near it, they attack them. And you can see the middle picture on the bottom, they've got ferocious teeth on them as well. But because they sit there for a good 2 or 3 weeks cutting, the tail actually completely wears out. And you can see the edge of that on the bottom left, you can see the bones sticking out of its tail. And they basically continue doing this until they just die. And it's quite sad, really, but it's quite amazing to watch how aggressive these females are. The Atlantic salmon lay their eggs, and the females just disappear and go and don't come back again. So we were unsuccessful in catching these ripe fish, as we call it. And not long after, we started to see natural post-spawning mortality, and this is where Colin's comments about nutrient enrichment come in, and also providing a food source for predation, for predators. Sorry, both of these fish seem to have been taken by otters. Quite easy if they're sat on the red defending them, then they're easy targets for those predators. And you can see the distinctive black tongue inside the male on the left there as well. So that left the only other option, which was to identify the reds, as many reds as we could, mark them, and then we could go back in when the eggs were at eyed stage, which is where they are more, where you can see the eye of the juvenile egg, and they're more robust, and that would allow us to dig them out of the red and then look at the development that way instead. So the first thing we did is we put a drone up to try and find more of these reds, and as you can see here, just in this small section, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In total, we counted about 100 reds in 2017, which so we only caught, there was only 8 fish caught, but there were 100 reds, which means there's 100 females potentially, which is quite shocking. And the other thing you'll notice here is these reds are very much spaced apart. If you look at Atlantic salmon reds, they are elongated, oval shape, and they quite often overlap. The reason these are round and separated is because the females are just so aggressive that they don't spawn next to each other. They just seem to have a gap between them. So what we did is we walked over to ensure that they were indeed pink reds, because they could well, we have sea lamprey in the river nest which spawn at a similar time as well. And then we marked them with a stone with just a bit of fluorescent tape so we could go back at a later time. So this was a difficult bit, trying to get the eggs. We thought, you know, we've got a good number of eggs identified in a particular area, a good number of reds, sorry, identified in a particular area. This is going to be an easy job. It took us 8 hours and 7 reds to be able to just get 200 eyed over. And it was hard going. You can see the picture on the left there. It was quite deep water and very heavy flow in the nest. So, but we managed to get the target 200 eggs. And then Marine Scotland Science provided an in-stream incubator, and we transferred these eggs into an incubator, which then sat in the gravel. And the idea is it has 2 baskets on it. One is buried in the gravel with gravel inside it with the eggs, and the other one will catch any emergent fry or smolts, as they are at this stage with pink salmon, and then we can look at the development. So in terms of development, so we checked them on the 18th of September, and you can see the eyes very clearly, the very black pupil with the black outline, which is quite distinctive of these pink salmon. So they were developing still on the 18th of September. Then on the 23rd of September, they actually started hatching, so which was quite a landmark moment as well. And then again on the 23rd, you can see even at this stage, this is the newly hatched Alvin with its yolk sac, but you can see the black tongue in this fish even at this stage, very distinctive pink salmon. So we have no survivors by the 15th of November, and that could have been to do with where the egg baskets were or the handling. Because we have to keep lifting them out of the gravel to check them. See this fish here, the yolk sac was diminishing and the fish was already turning silver. And these fish migrate to the sea as fry, so they don't spend a couple of years in fresh water. They migrate straight after hatch, well, pretty much straight after hatch, I think. And I believe the Spey did a similar project to us. They had the incubation boxes as well, and I think they managed to get them a bit further developed. So that at this point we knew that they spawned. We knew that the eggs were fertile and were fertilized, and then we knew that the eggs hatched, and we knew that the fish could emerge within our waters. So just to cut it short, in conclusion, so it's likely that at least a small proportion of the pink salmon contained in the reds in the nest went on to successfully emerge. But we think they may have emerged earlier than they would in the natural range. So they would have emerged around the November, December time rather than April, May. Now, this could potentially reduce the chances of survival. I think there's probably a little bit more work to be done there. We're not sure why they suddenly arrived in such numbers in 2017. It could be strong year class or environmental factors. What we did find was in 2019, we only had 2 reports. We had 1 fish past the camera and 1 fish turned up dead on the riverbank. And again, in 2021, we had, I think it was 2 fish caught and 2 fish found on captured on camera. And we didn't see any signs of reds this year. But I know other rivers that didn't have as many as us in 2017 had significant numbers this year. It suggests that perhaps they are more random in terms of the rivers they return to. And Colin's just done a great description of the potential risks. We don't know what the risk is. We really don't know at this point. There does seem to be limited interactions in freshwater. But the question I had, which Colin has touched upon there, is where do they feed at sea? Is there an overlap at any point? And with our Atlantic salmon numbers in decline and marine survival low, we just need to make sure that there isn't a problem out at sea. So that's my presentation. Again, just wanted to say thank you to Fisheries Management Scotland, Colin at S&H, and also Marine Scotland for the help that they gave us, the help and support they gave us through this process. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. We obviously knew before you started that you and Colin were going to be a perfect double act and nail it bang on 8 o'clock. So well done for that. I sort of watched this sort of process happening from the outside, having previously been involved with fisheries. But one of the key things that I've lifted from tonight's discussion and the presentations was, if you like, that there was such an effective collaboration in this response. This was something that wasn't expected in Scotland. Certainly the numbers that Colin referred over the last 56 years, a couple of dozen fish, and then suddenly we had tens and hundreds of fish arriving. And I think the response from individual fishery boards and trusts, Fishery Management Scotland, I think Brian Davidson's on this call, Colin on behalf of Nature Scot and Marine Scotland Science, I think you could almost argue that was an unusually collaborative response, but regardless of all of that, it was an effective one, and it brought forward the understanding and the collective knowledge on this issue in Scotland significantly. And I think the sort of reporting records that are now set up on the platform that Colin shared is a really effective tool to make sure that anglers and others that are involved in rivers have a place to report these records. Just in the passing there, Chris, you mentioned that, when you put your first record up, then suddenly another record from the net emerged the next day. And I think, sort of having somebody to report such records is really, really important for people that are keen to help, but sometimes don't quite know how and where to help. I think there have been a couple of wee questions picking up on these. One from Emma, and then I'm going to go back one a little bit. But Emma's asking if there are any plans to pit tag any of these fish to see where they go to at sea. I suspect these are very small fish as they head to sea.
Yeah,
probably too pit tag. But Chris, you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, so there'd be about probably 20 or 30 millimeters. So there wouldn't be the tagging technology to do that. And also the adults, obviously, they die after spawning. So the only way to do it would be to get hold of some adult fish at sea, I think, and just see where they are at that point. But you'd need to know where they are to do that, I guess. I don't know if Colin knows whether they're doing anything similar in Norway in terms of the marine trawls that they do.
Yeah, so they're doing quite a lot of marine trawling. Well, within reason, but obviously quite a large area to cover. So they've been doing some trawl work on them, trying to find out where they are at sea and what they feed on. But also in freshwater, they're doing some active acoustic tracking as well. So looking at behaviour within rivers and distribution, rates of movement, things like that within freshwaters. But you're absolutely right, Chris. These really small smolts, these things which are kind of 30 millimetres are far too small to tag by any sort of conventional means.
Thanks both. I'm going to go back to a question from Richard Pellinger, which I think you've probably responded a little bit already, but it just seems very opportune and of the moment really, and it's about what stopped the Pacific salmon historically spreading into the Atlantic. Maybe they don't like to go under the ice, but I guess if we're in a global warming scenario and Arctic ice is removed or reduced, is there an opportunity for these fish to spread naturally into the Atlantic via the northwest and northeast passages? Colin, did you have any immediate thoughts on that? I know you responded to it on the chat, but just so everyone's picking that up, because it's quite an interesting question as we respond to an evolving situation in climate and climate.
It's a really interesting question, because I mean, obviously these animals have been separated from the Atlantic and the Pacific for millennia. And there may well have been opportunities, as we've gone through. We talk about global warming now, but the Earth's gone through quite a number of these sorts of types of events, over the last tens of thousands of years. But yeah, this fish picked up, pink salmon were picked up in Newfoundland and off of the west coast of Greenland as well. There was some suggestion that maybe some of those fish actually did come from the Pacific and weren't anything to do with the White Sea introductions. So yeah, I mean, I would never rule anything out. Certainly we go through a position now where things are really changing. The northwest passage is really opening up. It's certainly a pathway for other invasives as well, not just. But yeah, the potential's there, I would think. But I would wonder why they hadn't done it before. Before now, if it was a natural thing.
Yeah, I think climate change is going to be one of the imponderables, really, as to the rate of that change and whether that can be slowed, and actually the consequences for species of all types moving to new ranges that suddenly become hospitable and inhospitable, both ways actually. Kyle Cran, further question on isotope analysis for oceanic distribution. I guess that's relation to whether they interact with Atlantic salmon in terms of feeding grounds and sites for development. I don't know if that's happening, Colin.
Yeah, so there's obviously this direct observation that I mentioned that Norwegians are doing, that are physically capturing fish and physically opening them up and looking at diet. There's also this Pinkses project that I mentioned in my sort of penultimate slide, which wants to do exactly that. Actually, is to look at reconstructing food webs using stable isotope analysis, both in marine environments and in fresh water. So yeah, those plans are in train. Funding is obviously the big issue, because I think that people need to be concerned enough that they would put money into this. As it seems, in some parts of, say for example, UK, it's not seemed to be as big an issue as it is in Norway, for example, where they're throwing quite a lot of money at it now because they recognise it's a really serious issue. It's probably unlikely that authorities in the UK will throw a lot of money at this until they also recognise that this, or come to the conclusion it's going to be a serious issue. But yeah, I mean, it has been done, but it's I think it's at an international level a bit piecemeal, but it needs to be more. There needs to be more coordination here, and that was one of the big messages from the Bering Sea conference last week. Was really about we don't need to. It's a common problem, and we need to sort of possibly pool our resources and our expertise into doing something meaningful. And SIAs, or stable isotope analysis, is one of those projects.
Yeah. Can I just add to what Colin's saying as well? And this is why projects like this are why it's really important that these carcasses of these fish are collected and retained. And as part of FMS's guidance, they ask that people hand in the fish to the local fishery board. That's really important, because the more of these samples we get, the more work can be done and the more we can learn from them. And this is exactly the type of project that they would be useful.
Thanks both, Colin and Chris there. I think we're at the end of the questions.